I'm Johanna Derlega, publisher of The Hill. Welcome to this morning's briefing, America's Opioid Epidemic Supporting Recovery. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Faces and Voices of Recovery and Indivior, for making it possible. Our conversation today, which is the fourth in a series of live events that we've convened on the opioid crisis, will explore services to support those looking to overcome addiction and help them get on the road to long-term recovery. In its final report, the White House Opioid Commission recommended expanding the use of recovery coaches and reinforced the value of peer-to-peer programs, skills training, and supportive housing. As the epidemic continues to devastate communities all across the country, how fast are Congress and the administration preparing to implement these recommendations? And will the $6 billion recently allocated to fighting the epidemic be enough? On our program today, we will hear from public health officials, lawmakers, and addiction experts about community-based strategies that can help turn the tide on this crisis. Before we get started, just a few notes of housekeeping. In addition to those of you here in the studio, we are live streaming on thehill.com. We ask that you turn your phones to silent, but we encourage you to join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at The Hill Events, and you can comment using the hashtag #SupportForRecovery. That's with the number 4. We're going to be taking questions throughout the program, so please keep an eye out for members of the team with handheld mics. And finally, there is a short survey on your chairs. We would love your feedback at the end of the program. So let's dive right in. We begin with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse is no stranger to working on the front lines of the opioid epidemic in his home state of Rhode Island, but also across the country. He's the lead author of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, CARA, which was signed into law in 2016 and provided funds and resources for opioid prevention and treatment programs. Welcome, Senator Whitehouse. And joining him on stage is my colleague, The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Johanna. Thanks, Senator, for joining us. I wanted to start just a little news of the day, news of the week. The Senate is debating immigration reform. You think a deal will get done, possibly by the end of this week?
There's a chance of it. It's been a little bit disappointing. What I think many of us had hoped was that there would be a good faith, sincere, bipartisan effort to try to work through to a bill that could support the Dreamer kids and be an opening chapter on a larger conversation about immigration down the road. Then we discovered that we'd only get a week,
right,
which in Senate schedule means 3 days. I don't know what's happening next week in the Senate that's so important we can't keep on this. And the opening bid from the Republicans was a vote on sanctuary cities, which has nothing to do with DACA, nothing to do with Dreamers, and is more or less political fighting words on this issue. So that wasn't a very, hands across the water opening. Mm-hmm. So it looks like we've kind of reverted, maybe through habit, bad habit, into some traditional modes of behavior, and I'd hoped for better on this subject, but that doesn't mean that an agreement can't still be reached, and certainly this adds some pressure to people to try to wrap up. There's a lot of negotiation taking place.
And that won't stop this week. I mean, let's say a deal is not reached. I mean, that will continue. Those talks will at least continue.
The talks ought to continue.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Although when the leader is saying, this is your chance,
right,
that's not a great signal.
On the opioid epidemic, how has it affected your state? What has worked? What needs to be improved? And when you've seen success stories, what are the keys to recovery?
We're in the forefront of hard-hit states, mm-hmm. Unfortunately. We have hundreds of fatal casualties every year from overdoses. Most memorable to me is a little community up in northern Rhode Island called Burrillville, which has maybe 5,000 people and maybe like 30 police officers in the police department. In the first 3 months of 1 year while we were working the CARA bill, mm-hmm. they had 6 fatalities in that little town. And, everybody knows everybody, and it's like beating on a bruise at that point when those tragedies just happen one after another after another. We are doing some exciting things. Two that I'll flag are getting peer recovery coaches into emergency rooms when somebody comes in with an overdose. We're now rating our hospitals on getting that done. So there's going to be less of you come in overdosed, you get Narcan back to health, you go back out, and you go back to the life again. You'll at least have a recovery coach pursuing you and letting you know that there's an option. And then we've got a terrific program with a couple of police departments in which recovery professionals actually go out and ride along with the police. And when matters come up during the regular course of the police department's business in which it looks like there's an issue with a house, the recovery expert and a police officer got plain clothes all the time in the world just to talk, hear your options, hear the different things you can do in recovery, and make it a project to try to help the family through whatever's going on and get onto the road to recovery. And I spent a lot of years in law enforcement, and police departments are not the most change-forward institutions in the world. So there was a little bit of like, really? We're doing this? And then they saw it in action, and now they're our best advocates. So those are, I think, two important, fairly new things that we've been doing that have helped. And we're starting to see the numbers come down a little bit. We're still struggling with the question of how you let family members and loved ones know when somebody comes in. The bad side of the HIPAA rules is that a parent doesn't know that their 24-year-old son has been in 3 times overdosed, and by the time the 4th happens and it's fatal, they haven't had a chance to engage. So we're working on
So that's
that.
because of the privacy rules that the parents can't be told if they're over 18?
If they're over 18.
Right.
And we're working around that and trying to get it into electronic health records and get people to waiver it so that they've got somebody who they love and cares about them who can do that. But I don't think we've got that one nailed yet, but we're working on it.
How would you grade the Trump administration on combating opioid abuse?
Great talk. National emergency. Look at the budgets, and it's a disaster. They're going the wrong direction. Look at the hiring, and they have, this like 24-year-old college kid with no experience running ONDCP. It's almost like it's a slap at the office of ONDCP. And it seems to be being run by the political shop in the White House, which may be more interested in credit taking and positioning than in actually doing anything. So that's been very, very disappointing. And I think that's one of the reasons that Congress responded so forcefully in this last funding measure, where we announced a pledge for $6 billion in additional opioid funding on top of the second $500 million that we were owed from last year's agreement, and on top of the increases that we've seen into the opioid programs of about $170, $180 million in the last funding measure. So in the absence of serious executive leadership, I think Congress has really stepped up in a big way, and I'm very proud of my colleagues for having put that kind of money behind this problem.
On the money and the resources, where do you see the need for it going forward? I mean, obviously there's going to be more money needed. You mentioned this $6 billion, which is a lot of money. However, there was $45 billion in the Obamacare repeal bill that was voted down. When do you think is the next installment going to be needed?
I think the most important, we'll see how this plays out. To me, the most important place for money to go is when somebody presents someplace ready for treatment, ready for engagement, ready for recovery. You've got to be able to say yes then. Telling an addict who has come in and said, I can't stand this any longer, I need to get clear of this, and answering, next Thursday at 2, how does that work for you? That just doesn't help at all. I also think that the prescription drug monitoring programs have been terrible, sloppy, uncoordinated, and we need to continue to improve those. and a little bit of funding to support that would help a lot. There are a lot of areas that can help, but the biggest one is making sure that when somebody presents ready for recovery, boom, they have access.
We have a story in the Hill today about Attorney General Jeff Sessions created a debate where he recently said that some people should just take aspirin and tough it out. Now, some say that was inappropriate. Others say it was a just point because there's overprescribing. Where do you fall?
I think there's been a little bit of both. I actually came into this issue years ago when a study came out from Brown University in Rhode Island that said half of the folks who died in Rhode Island hospitals, their families reported that they had died in pain. And of the half who had been reported to have died in pain, the pain was reported as being extreme or excruciating. So obviously something was going wrong when that was happening, when at the end of life, you really aren't worried about addiction consequences very much. You really want people to be comfortable. So we pushed in from that point of view to make pain fifth vital sign and do things like that. And then it just kind of kept running. I think OxyContin is a big cash cow for the pharmaceutical industry, encouraged certain behaviors that weren't all that helpful. I think the sense that these were prescribed drugs rather than something off the street made them feel safer. And we had the enormous run the other way. I remember my daughter having her wisdom teeth out and getting, I think, 40 Vicodins.
40?
Yeah, like maybe she took 2. So now you've got 38 sitting there in the medicine cabinet for the next round of kids who come over to the house to go prowling for, and we can do a lot better. CVS is doing a good job lowering the amount it dispenses. One of the things that CARA did was it authorized you to come in if you thought there was an issue, say, look, to the pharmacist, give me 4, and I can come back for the other 36 if I need them.
Right.
You weren't allowed to do that before. The pharmacist wasn't allowed to do that before. He had to follow the script. So little steps like that, better prescribing practices. We need to turn the corner back. But I don't want to be back in the day either when a dying patient in a nursing home is dying in pain because we're so frightened of opioids that we'd prefer to put them through that misery.
You mentioned CARA, which you authored. How has it been?
With Rob Portman of
he's got it, he was at an event also talking about his the issues in his state of Ohio. How has it been the implementation of that bill? Everyone talks about bill passing, and then the implementation doesn't get as much attention.
It's getting there. If I think there were more, back to the executive branch, if there were more attention being paid to rolling out the new programs and getting them funded and so forth, I think that could have gone more rapidly. We are dialing up CARA 2.0 to make sure that we're aligned with this new slug of $3 billion per year over 2 years, the $6 billion in funding, and taking advantage of that. So as far as I'm concerned, we really got to push the hammer forward and just go, 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 and get this done because it's so urgent in so many places.
You mentioned Senator Portman. These are, as you know, very polarizing times, but this issue doesn't discriminate for party affiliation. No. What in the Senate, is there a bunch of you that work together, because this has affected so many states, some more than others, obviously, to put politics as much as possible aside?
Yeah.
And what is that group? Who is that group that you're talking to? Obviously, Portman.
It's, you look at the big states that are getting clobbered and look at their senators, they're listening. Vermont, New Hampshire, West Virginia, Maine, Rhode Island, Ohio, Pennsylvania. You've got a, you can do the deduction.
Yes,
and figure out from the state's problem who's most interested. But this is a very bipartisan thing, as you saw in the last funding bill.
Sure. Backstage, you were talking to the Surgeon General, and he came to your state. How did that come about?
I invited him.
And he came.
Yeah.
This is a member of the Trump administration.
We had this wonderful thing called advice and consent, where they need my vote, and they have a hearing, and I get at the hearing to say, will you come to Rhode Island? And no, Dr. Adams is terrific, and we wanted to bring him there to talk about the recovery community, which is doing such a good job in Rhode Island. We wanted to bring him there to talk about the community dealing with end-of-life care, which is also doing a really important job in Rhode Island. And he came up and he was terrific. He's a wonderful individual personally. And we were at the hospice facility in Providence, and there was a gentleman who had served as an Army medic in Korea, a wonderful man who was there for his final days with his family around. And Dr. Adams came in and talked about great bedside manner.
Mm-hmm. Pretty impressive.
Pretty impressive.
We've got a few minutes left. What I want to do is open it up for questions from the audience. If you can raise your hand, and we have people with mics, because once again, we are live streaming on thehill.com, so that our audience can hear it. We've got one in the, we're going to go there, and then we'll go there. First here.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Melissa Clark. Can I hold the mic? Dr. Melissa Clark from Medical Home Development Group. Right here in Washington, D.C., we're office-based opioid use disorder treatment. And one of the points I wanted to make is that, as you all may know, opioid use disorder is a chronic disease. And one of the points that you made was that you wanted people to be there ready to treat at the time. One of the challenges to treatment is that when you get certified to prescribe buprenorphine in an office-based setting as a physician, you can only treat 30 people per year in your first year. What sorts of legislative action can be taken to expand the capability of physicians to treat this epidemic, just as if we were in the middle of a cholera epidemic or any other kind of epidemic, we wouldn't limit the providers.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And similarly, there have been some restrictions on how many people can be in an inpatient facility as well. So to be perfectly candid, I don't remember where we are on that. I know that's an issue that we're looking at. I don't remember if that's being worked through the executive branch, trying to get administrative rule changes, or whether we're trying to do that by statute. But I'm happy to follow up and let you know, because we are focused on that issue, and I just can't recall how in the cloud of issues that we've got around us.
Well, I would very much appreciate that. We're the largest provider of opioid treatment in D.C. on an office-based facility to Medicaid patients, and it's a real limitation to be able to treat individuals here in D.C., which unfortunately has gone from 22nd in the nation per capita in overdose rates to second in the nation in overdose rates, and people don't realize it. It is also an urban problem as well.
And understanding and enhancing medication-assisted treatment is one of the really vital things that we need to make sure we're propagating out there, so people have access to it, and when they do, it's high-quality treatment best practices. Yes, so thank you for what you're doing.
In the middle right here, I promise this woman. Just identify yourself on the end.
Sure. John Winslow. I'm with the National Council on Alcoholism, the Maryland chapter. Also a person in long-term recovery, which for me means I haven't used alcohol or other drugs for over 42 years. So we know that recovery works. With the $7 billion in the new budget, I understand that President Trump is looking to shift many of those dollars from prevention, treatment, and recovery support services back to enforcement. It appears that we're moving backwards and returning to the war on drugs, or maybe more appropriately, the war on people on drugs. I am exceedingly concerned about this shift. Any response to that?
Yeah, well, keep your eye on that. The bill with the $6 billion in it was crafted between Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. The Oval Office had essentially nothing to do with that. I think we find on occasion that we actually do better work the more they just clear out and let us do our work. And this was just a general funding caps measure and a commitment as to how much under those caps is going to be spent. That commitment now moves into the appropriations process. And Republicans and Democrats in Congress, the appropriators, are going to decide where that $6 billion goes, into what accounts. So the president can have his point of view, but Congress disposes. We have the power of the purse. And I think the momentum is very strongly in favor of recovery support and the areas that you mentioned, and not dialing that funding back into more enforcement. So I think while that is a legitimate concern to watch out for, it's not something that I see any momentum for in Congress, and I'd be surprised if when the appropriators did their work, that was still a concern. Doesn't mean we shouldn't look out for it, but let me be a voice of reassurance that the people in Congress who want to get this done are not thinking that way.
Right in the front here.
Just a quick word on the gentleman with 40 years of recovery. One of the things that I think has been very important here, not only in CARA, but also in the way that conversation has gone, is that we are more and more, day by day, moving recovery out of the stigma and shame that was associated with it. And I think people more and more understand that a path of sober living and a path of recovery is actually difficult and brave and noble to achieve in your life. And the more that we can echo that, I think we need to get that message out there.
Absolutely.
Good morning, Senator Whitehouse. I'm Carol McDade, and I am with Capital Decisions.
Hello, Carol.
Hi, and I'm also a person in long-term recovery. And I want to thank you first, before asking a question, for being a champion for recovery before it was politically cool and politically popular to do so. You were there for us for a long time before it became kind of a popular thing to be for, and we appreciate that. There's been some discussion that you and Senator Portman may, this was before the $6 billion, may introduce legislation sooner rather than later to lay out some of the priorities that you see. Is that still likely to happen given
Yes.
this commitment on $6 billion?
Yes.
And can you show us a little leg on what the recovery provisions might look like in that bill?
It's to give you.
I'm going to use that.
You can draw the. We're calling it CARA 2.0, so it's obviously going to be very aligned with the original CARA bill that we wrote. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that the $6 billion, it's actually $3 billion over 2 years, so a total of 6, but $3 billion per year, gets dedicated and appropriated in ways that are consistent with the direction that the Congress displayed in CARA. And so we're trying to meld the commitment and the CARA principles together. And maybe as soon as next week, we'll have something to announce. We're trying to sort it out fairly quickly.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, we've run out of time for this session. Please thank the senator, and I'll hand it back to
Thank you all.
Johanna.